Well, hey guys, we are going to introduce you guys today to this idea of what we call a frequency histogram and a frequency polygon. But the best way to get that sorted is probably to show you. We'll actually create one, and they come from data that we collect from an experiment. So in this case, our experiment, or the thing we're doing, is we're rolling a die 40 times. Now a single dice on its own is called a die, and we're going to roll it 40 times. Now every time we roll it, we could get one of these results, couldn't we? There's 6 faces on a die. And when I record, every time I roll it, I record it, and I get what we call a frequency. Now, frequency is just how often something, or how many times something happens. So in this experiment, when I did 40 rolls, 8 of them were the number 1. The number 2 came up 4 times, the number 3 came up 8 times, etc. And this is what we call a frequency table. Now, we're going to take that data, and we're going to graph it. Now, ordinarily, traditionally, you might have done what we call a column chart. So a column chart looks something like this. Let's say we've got some graph paper. What goes on a column chart? Now, when we're recording frequencies, it's really important. We always put the frequencies up on the left-hand side, going vertically. And across the bottom is where we put our scores, and that's what these numbers represent. Okay, the score of 1 happened 8 times. It has a frequency of 8. So frequency goes up the left, scores go across the bottom. Now in this case, my scores could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I'm going to put them across the bottom. I'm going to make this the number 1 column. I'm going to leave a gap, and I'm going to make this my number 2 column. So I'm going to label them across the bottom of each column. Now my frequencies, the highest frequency, the number that came up the most was the number 5, and happened 10 times. So I've got to go up 10 boxes, but I don't have 10 boxes. So I'm going to have to get creative in this case, and I'm going to make every one of these boxes worth 2. So I end up with this. This would be 2, frequency 4, 6, 8, and 10. Because I couldn't fit the 10 on, so sometimes you might have to get a little bit creative with your numbering. And the last thing that we always put on a column chart to make sure it's complete is we put a title. Right? What is our data representing? Well, in this case, it was the frequency of 40 die rolls. Okay, we are ready now to put some columns onto this column chart. Now, the score of 1 had a frequency of 8. So in my 1 column, I'm going to go up as far as the number 8. And I'm going to create a nice colorful column that represents the score of 1 happening 8 times. The score of 2 happened 4 times. It has a frequency of 4. So going up till I hit the line that represents the 4 is where my column's going to go. Number 3 is going to go up to 8, so I can see in this column here, I'm going to have to go right up as far as the 8 line. Okay, and you can repeat the process now. Now 7, you'll see I don't have a 7 on my frequencies, but it's halfway between 6 and 8. So I'm going to take my column up till it sits halfway between the 6 and the 8. 10 goes all the way up to here. 6 happened 3 times, so once again I'm going to have to go halfway between the 2 and the 4. Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations, you have just created a lovely looking column chart, and that is what we call a visual representation of our data. Okay, you can look at that. This bunch of numbers kind of is pretty boring. It doesn't tell me much information, but we're looking at this, I can see straight away, yep, this one happened the most, this one happened the least, and it's a nice visual representation of our data. Now, we are going to take that data and we're going to create something very similar with a few little changes. Okay, a column chart and a frequency histogram are very similar, except for a couple of very important differences. So we're now going to create a frequency histogram from the same data. So I'm going to start with my graph paper. Most of the things around the sides are the same, and my frequency is going to look exactly the same. It's going to go up to 10. I'm still going to put my scores across the bottom. However, when I put my scores, this is where the first difference comes in. I want you to count across 2 columns or 2 sections. So starting from the 0, 1, 2, and that's where I'll put my first score. And then I'm going to put every second line will have the score. So here I go. I get 2 boxes. There's number 1. I leave 2 till I get to number 2. I jump another 2, another 2, another 2, another 2, and you'll see in a minute why we do that and why it's kind of important. So already now that's starting to look a little bit different. That's the first difference that we've come across from our column chart, is the way we put our scores across the bottom. All right, here's the next difference. Now I'm going to put in my columns just like in my column chart, but I want to come across, I want to leave one column here. This piece, I want to start here, and my column is 2 boxes wide, right? So in other words, I've got a column here that you can see it's twice as wide as this one. It spans across the 2 grids, the 2 sort of vertical sections of the grid paper. Okay, it goes up to the same point. It still goes up to a frequency of 8, but it's 2 wide. So one complete column is 2 grids wide. That's going to repeat the process now for my number 2. That score was rolled 4 times, and you'll see I don't leave any gap. I put it straight next to the first one. I repeat the process for 3, okay, and these scores haven't changed, right? They are exactly the same frequencies and scores as my column chart, but you'll see that they're double wide and there's no gaps in between them, okay? So that's the first big difference. Actually, that's it. We're done. We've created our frequency histogram. It represents the same data. It looks a lot like a column chart, but a couple of important differences. And let's just summarize what those differences are. The first thing is there's no gaps between the columns. Okay, up here I had gaps that you could see. Down here, every column has no gaps. The second important difference is I left a half a column gap at the start and half a column gap at the finish. Now we'll talk about that in a minute, but if you have a look at the start, if a column is this wide, half of that width is one of these grid sections. So I leave one and then I start my double-sized box. Okay, so always leave a half column gap at the start and a half column gap at the finish, which would mean I would end up at this point here. What's this point got to do with anything? Well, we're about to find out, because on top of our frequency histogram now, I'm going to put what we call a frequency polygon. It's nice and easy. This is the last thing we're going to look at in this lesson. All I do is I go to the top middle of each of my columns in my histogram and I put a little dot. Right? So at the top of the one, in the middle, I put a dot. If I go to the middle of my 2 column, right there is where I'm going to put my little dot. And I do the same for every column in my histogram. Now, the last bit to turn this into a polygon, which is, I'm going to draw a straight line that goes through all these dots. But I start down here in the bottom left, at 0, 0 in the bottom left. And then I go through, and from that point, I draw a line that just connects the dots. And it will end up looking something like that. Where does it finish? It finishes back at 0, half a column gap at the end. Remember we said we leave half a column gap at the start and half a column gap at the finish. And that is what we call a frequency polygon. So that line, that black line going over my frequency histogram, is a frequency polygon. You guys rock. That's it. Congratulations. You've now drawn up a frequency histogram, a frequency polygon, and we've identified the differences between just a regular, ordinary, old column chart. Okay, I am going to get you guys, however, to do a little exercise for me. We are going to change these numbers in a minute. I'm going to give you some different scores for another 40 rolls. So imagine we rolled it another 40 times and we got some different scores. And I want you to draw up the column chart, the frequency histogram, and the frequency polygon into your workbook or whatever you're keeping your notes in. I want you to take that data and create for me the column chart, the frequency histogram, and the frequency polygon. All right, obviously, if you need to pause at any time and go back and have a look at this video, you can do that. So feel free to do that. But here we go. I'm about to give you the data that I want you guys to use for your task. There you go. We've changed the numbers. We've got another 40 rolls. There's our scores. There's our frequencies. Go for it. All right, good job. Well done.